I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that cost literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to the range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I'd mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot that I had seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbit or owls. The deer that I had seen were hundreds of yards away from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing it up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I had been leaning against earlier. The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something that I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl, and I heard it. A voice coming from that direction. A very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sight was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I had been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help, please, I can't walk," the voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes an animal's eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Fuck off," I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained to the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling, and I knew that my voice had cracked a little bit on a last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite of the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap it for a fresh one, but I dropped it and I didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck and wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him, because the spot we were camping in was technically in the same forest I had seen that bastard, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked, his mom, which was my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole on these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw definitely was a wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such things exist, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, I wanted to share this. When I was young, we used to live in a house that had a big sloping backyard that backed down on a big oval. Our fence line was along one end. The other was a big forest that went on for miles. On the opposite side was a fence line and all the housing estate. Right smack bang in the middle of this field was play equipment. There was 0 people around here, as it was quite isolated and not many people frequented this oval. Me and my sister used to run down our sloping backyard, jump the fence, and run across to the play equipment almost every day. One day we went out and we were playing as usual, having loads of fun. I remember climbing to the top of the equipment and sitting there with my sister. As we looked forward, we were facing the forest side, probably 100 to 200 meters away. There was a row of bushes along the front of the entrance to the forest, and out of nowhere, something caught my eye. It looked like a black object, bob up and down quickly. I told my sister, and we started watching that area, waiting. Then, clear as day, we saw 2 people poke their heads up, completely dressed in black from head to toe, with what I recognize today as possibly balaclavas or hoodies. Me and my sister sat there frozen. This went on for several minutes as they watched us. We made the decision to bolt as fast as we could towards our left, which was our fence line. I ran as fast as I think I ever had run, straight up to the fence, jumped it, and ran straight up the backyard and into our house. To this day, me and my sisters always mention the people in black, and I get shivers. Maybe it was some people playing a prank. It just seemed like such an isolated area, and no one would have seen us if a struggle had broken out. But the distance between the forest line would have given us a good chance to run had they attempted anything. We used to go down there every day, so it creeps the hell out of me to think how long they may have been planning this, or if it just was some elaborate prank. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still don't know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting university. Our home was and still is just outside of a small town with forests all around it. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from a river that ran miles to the forest and split into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I continued to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in the forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone, or with my dad over the span of 18 years, but we never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone. The first time, I left in the morning. I walked along the path from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands into the water, I hear a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring, which I found strange. I listened well, and wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. It was a dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much of a smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream. So had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while I was walking that way, I suppose. Nothing else really happened that day, but 1 week later I went back for the second time that summer, and it was the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour. Then I decided to go back the way I came, because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest, when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet, dripping with green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it. Then, I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain. My senses became confused. I felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body after I had passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream, back towards the path for a while, when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while I was running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling that I had. It was like I just shit out my intestines and my stomach. I literally felt the hairs on the back of my neck raise despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear, combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly, was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walking thing again, because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me, a tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing the bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my fucking life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied and yelled, "I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here." I wanted to yell, "Dad, please, where are you?" But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was at the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the tone of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him. When we got to each other, my dad heard the bell too. My mom could even hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car, ready to leave fast. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fires with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got the notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, and we hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small, hidden fires. Nothing bad had happened. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times and never had any problems. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with the family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off at our old spot where we used to start out, right outside our hometown. She thought it was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, and we had a map, so I gave it a what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some good canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought some small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over the hill and we were actually camping in their front yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything on top of this sort of hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from the years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, which was also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and built-up sections in front for the preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no paths, no roads. It was just an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move out early in the morning. Night set in, and as we laid in our hammocks shooting the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went like this: "Do you hear that? The fuck is that? Sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sounds were coming from. We could still move, very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so we wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly down the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw the light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intentions of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer it in a song. This lasted for a while, then they all broke into this long sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears, then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out of the open doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we had came from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could, but we eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and when we walked there, we got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that ever happened to me out in the woods.